Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, the majority of them have not been convicted, have not been put through trial.
I would see that only internationalization can work because the two sides don't trust each other. There must be a third party who can mediate between them.
It's not Britain who's going to say where a road is going to be built in Gaza. Gazans will say where they want the road to be built, and they'll need help to build it. Without the ending of military occupation, there is no real development. How much water we get, what we can import, what we can export, where we can build our homes, how we move about. The majority of this military occupation is dealt to us administratively.
I don't see the Israeli occupation as a rational exercise of either control or getting to an endpoint of, say, seizing territory. I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the show where sometimes the world itself actually provides a semblance of order or hope in our mad, 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 mad world. And today, that semblance of order is the so-called Trump ceasefire in Gaza plan. We don't know what it has to say about post-war governance of Gaza, and those are the kind of questions that I'm going to delve into today with my guest. We're going to delve into the situation of the occupation and what America is doing in the Middle East. Then we're going to talk about the Palestinian economy. We're going to talk about the situation for Hamas. We're going to talk about the role of Gulfies in rebuilding the occupied territories. We're going to talk about the nature of the occupation. We're going to talk about Palestinian reforms and the PA, and is there a possibility for genuine democratic bottom-up governance there? Fascinating topics. So why don't you follow the link in the show notes? Join the Mega Orderers Club where you can get all our episodes as soon as they are recorded. You also will get them ad-free and various other perks. The link for the Mega Orderers Club is in the show notes. Back to the situation in Israel-Palestine. This week, we are honored to be joined from Ramallah by Sam Bahour. Sammy is a Palestinian-American entrepreneur and writer based in the West Bank. Sam moved from Ohio to Palestine in the 1990s. He's played quite a big role in developing the local economy, especially in tech and telecommunications. Welcome to Disorder, Sam.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So we have to start with the obligatory, which is this Trump peace deal. Is this just a massive branding exercise, or is there any actual peace deal to the so-called deal?
I think in your introduction, you indicated correctly. This is not a plan, not a strategic move by any stretch of the imagination. And just watching Trump for the last 9 months, one should come to the conclusion he doesn't have the capacity to make such a historic plan. What this is, in my opinion, is a saving Israel from itself plan. Israel went too far, supported by the US, maybe directed even by the US, dumped about 5 times as much firepower on this tiny strip of the Gaza Strip that was dropped on Hiroshima. All of that did not result in getting their hostages back or disarming or dismantling Hamas. Thus, what I think this plan was all about was that the US, especially after Israel struck Qatar, either with or without US support or clearance, they were clearly found to be crossing another red line, which threatened the US's relationship with the Gulf region, which is catastrophic for Trump and his cohort, because that's where their even personal business relations lie. So I think Trump, being a deal maker, saw that that was an opportunity to pressure Netanyahu into understanding that it's over. And what this plan resulted in, these 20 points, if you read them without thinking of the daily death that's happening, it's laughable. I mean, it's comic book material. But again, we're living reality. Reality is that there's people being held hostage. There are people dying by the hundreds per day. And there's thousands and thousands of Palestinians languishing in Israeli prisons. With that reality in mind, one takes a different look at this plan, so-called plan. And I think that's exactly what Hamas did. Very shrewdly. I mean, I've never been a fan of Hamas, but they are shrewd negotiators.
I want to ask you more about Hamas being shrewd. I have been trying to follow the Israeli military analysis and some Israeli commentators more than I would otherwise, and they have seemed to indicate that Hamas was on the back foot and that the Gaza City offensive has pinned them in, or they're worried about losing territory or can't fight anymore. Do you think that that's at all real, that the military pressure that was applied is part of the reason that we got to this moment?
It definitely plays a role. I mean, a genocide has been taking place. It's not about Gaza City. Gaza as a strip has been demolished, annihilated. So at the end of the day, I mean, and we were told this about Rafah. That was the red line. We have to go into Rafah because that would end this. They went into Rafah despite U.S. rejection, and they just moved on. And then it was Khan Yunis, and they just moved on. And now it's Gaza City. We've been living this reality of Israelis creating these obstacles that need to be passed because they're so strategic, only to find the next obstacle is the next strategic one. And I think although the military destruction plays a role, and the despair of our own people in Gaza plays a role. People are in famine. People are starving. And that creates a motivation for any leadership, whether elected or not, to take action. And they responded strategically. They said, the first 3 points we fully agree with. Yes, but. And the first 3 points were what the U.S., I believe, was out to get. Stopping the war, getting the hostages home, and getting relief to come in. Those are the 3 things. Everything else in the plan, Hamas did not accept. They actually deferred many of the items to the PLO because they are not responsible for what the entire Palestinian people want. So in a way, they challenged the U.S. to see what kind of appetite they have to come through on the threat that they made only 24 hours later, 24 hours before, which was, if you don't, Hamas, accept this as is, there's hell to be paid. Well, Hamas did not accept it as is, and you only heard the yes out of the yes but. So in a way, it was kind of confirming that the U.S.'s goal was to save Israel.
The reality that you paint there is one where America has strategic leverage over the Israeli cabinet, and it just hasn't deployed it previously or enough. And that's something that I believe, Sam. We may come at some topics later differently, but I've been a firm believer that Biden and Jake Sullivan were woeful at using their leverage to get Israel to do what was in America and the West's, as well as Israel's interests, the whole tough love approach. To pivot from this big picture deal, which we could complain about and dissect for hours, I want to hear what it's like on the ground. What is the vibe in the West Bank about the deal? What was the vibe about the 2-year anniversary of October 7th, both of the heinous attack, but then also of the overreaction? Give us a kind of on-the-ground perspective.
It was a very sober couple of days these days. There's not a celebratory mood here where I am in the West Bank. Yes, there are kids, singing in the streets in Gaza because they know that they can be alive tomorrow. That was a big deal for them, and it should be. But the bigger picture here, and I must make this up front, is that Israel and the U.S., but mainly Israel, has been adamant of making this an Israel-Hamas thing. It is not an Israel-Hamas thing. It's an Israel-Palestinian thing. And this thing is basically a long-term strategic effort by Israel to gain as much geography as possible from the Palestinians with the least amount of Palestinian demography on it. What do I mean by that? I've been here since the Oslo Accords were signed. I came hopeful, but understanding that the military occupation had not ended. And without the ending of military occupation, there is no real development. We can act towards development, take steps toward development, but real economic development, and I can say this now with 30-some years behind me, cannot be done under military occupation. I mean, when I came from the U.S., I came to establish the telecommunications company. Myself and the current Palestinian Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa, we established that company. It's a $1 billion company. And although we read in the agreement of Oslo that the telecom network is going to be, we have the right for it to be separate and independent. Those are the words that are used. Those are the 2 words that actually made me relocate. When I got here and figured out that Israel only gives you a right, but they don't give you the tools to be able to implement that right. So it's like me telling you, if you don't like what I'm saying, you can leave the studio. But I don't tell you that I locked up all the doors and windows. There's no way to leave. And that's what they did. And telecom is a good example. But they did it in all the sectors. And this this ongoing military occupation, this violent military occupation, you see the visible part of it. You see settlements, you see checkpoints, you see gates around our cities. Those are all things you can take pictures of. What you don't see is the majority of this military occupation, which I would claim is dealt to us administratively. How much water we get, what we can import, what we can export, where we can build our plants, where we can build our homes, how we move about within the West Bank and Gaza before the war. So in that reality, fast forward to the beginning of 2023, Netanyahu gets elected. 2023 was the worst year for Palestinians in the last decades. Why? The settlers went on a rampage in the West Bank. Israel had this right-wing fascist government that basically was calling for the destruction of Palestinian cities outright. At the same time, inside Israel, the democracy campaign against what Netanyahu was doing to disrupt the judiciary system was at a peak. And that's one of the reasons I think Hamas miscalculated the timing. I think Netanyahu's government was a dead government walking.
It was on the verge of collapse. He was being turfed out because of
Exactly.
the judicial overreach, kind of like what Trump has wanted to do of make the Supreme Court not independent. Netanyahu was on the verge of doing that. I'm just giving that as background for the listeners.
Absolutely.
I think you said a few interesting things there that I want to jump back to before we go further afield. One is the matrix of occupation. I have experience in this domain. I read Arabic and Hebrew. I have done a master's degree about the Middle East and its conflict. I think that matrix of occupation and matrix of control sounds to me and too structured. From 1967, as I read things, you have a series of inadvertent steps, many of which were caused by non-governmental actors, the settlers, and then later legalized. And this thing that we have is a web more than a matrix because it doesn't work. In other words, it's not better for the Palestinians, what I'm describing. It's probably worse, right? What I see in the occupation as I've studied it and understood it is you have 27 different actors, some of whom coordinate, many of whom don't. One is seizing a hilltop. The religious are doing this. This one is concerned about this land. There's no real structure to get to a definitive outcome. I see a lot of chaos in that web. When you are talking about your situation in the ICT sector, how does that chaos of overlapping jurisdictions between government, army, settlers, maybe Israeli private sector, which are yet another things, how does that leave where you're at?
Good point. I'd like to take a step back and not start at 1967, but 1948 to kind of push back on what you said. If we look from 1948 to 1967, you have legislation and reports, official reports, coming out of the governments of Israel, systematically, consistently defining the discrimination against Palestinians, whether it's land expropriation, whether it's the law of return. I mean, there's 68, I think, laws which discriminate against those Palestinians that we stayed inside Israel, after Israel was created. And then we come into 1967, and you also find report after report, which is not haphazard, but rather strategic planning, saying what they want to see as the end game. I'll give you an example. The strategic planning exercise for Jerusalem happens every, I think, 5 or 10 years. And they put numbers to it. The Palestinian population in Jerusalem must not exceed 30%. And then all the other players that you're talking about act in that spirit. So I do think that there's rhyme and rhythm. If this was a 5-year conflict, I might agree with what you're saying. This is an 80-year conflict, and the trend lines show clear trajectory over time. And they're very clear.
I would say it's a 140-year conflict going back to the first Aliyah, but the length and duration doesn't mean coordination among the actors, just as the Israeli society is terribly divided between the religious right and then the very secular left, and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are two unbelievably different places. You know, you might as well be in Siberia as opposed to Moscow in terms of the differences in those tiny geographies. So I don't want us to get lost in a history debate that doesn't necessarily bear on what we're talking about.
For sure. That was only the context I wanted to give. If we fast forward to Israel today, what's Israel today? It's a militaristic environment where the military plays a role that people in the West may not fully understand. It is an integral part of people's lives. What does that mean? Your career advancement kind of depends on your service in the Israeli military.
Particularly in the IT sector, obviously.
Overall, let me give you an example. I'm a commander in the Israeli military, and I'm put in the Ramallah area to safeguard an area. An incident happens. The first thing I do is I set up a checkpoint to make sure I have control. What should happen when the incident is over, the checkpoint gets removed. But who wants to remove a checkpoint that tomorrow may be the reason for another incident? Times that by 100 or 200 or 300 locations, then you have that matrix. So I agree with you.
Okay, I'm a little
everything
less
is planned
than that, and it is my podcast, so I need to push back a little bit here.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a little less conspiratorial than that, Sam. I think that the occupation in the West Bank is highly dysfunctional, and I can understand your perspective of overarching planning and goals. Those goals may be articulated, but I don't see any rational means to get to them, just like the fact that Trump has various goals, for example, about deporting Hispanic migrants who are illegal aliens, but he doesn't have goals to get there. And this is an important claim for me, so I can't let it go. I see neopopulism as identifying problems, making the problems worse, but not actually having solutions. And this is something that Netanyahu, Trump, Orban, Farage, I think all share in common. They identify a problem. They then maybe articulate a horrific solution like build the wall, deport the this, send in the National Guard. But they don't actually send in the National Guard in a reasonable way that's going to fix the problem. So I don't see the Israeli occupation as a rational exercise of either control or getting to an endpoint of, say, seizing territory. And let's just park this. We have other I think interesting things that we can discuss. And I want to point out about the army, this is just a very normal situation for a Middle Eastern state. Your relationship to the Egyptian army is absolutely critical for your career advancement in Egypt. Do you know what I mean? If you're in the construction industry in Egypt, you better be on good with the Egyptian army. They own 25% of the land, and almost all the major construction companies in Egypt are connected to the army. So I just wouldn't set that up as a very sui generis thing.
But they're working with their own people. They're not an occupying force. But I want to just give you a case just to keep in mind about not having the goal. About 10 years ago, one of our biggest sectors here is the stone and marble sector. Stone and marble comes from mines, what they're called quarries. 10 years ago, the Israelis said, we're going to allow our mining companies in Tel Aviv, for example, to go into the West Bank and literally take the land, take the stone and marble. An Israeli human rights organization took that to the Israeli High Court. What did they decide? Yes, they're allowed. So there is mechanisms, and those trucks came into the West Bank and come in today and take the land. So there are mechanisms to make sure that the political aspirations are served. So I think it's much more accurate in terms of action than just haphazard. Understanding.
That's not my view, right, Sam? As I said, I think it's really
important. If I had enough time, I can give you enough examples that I think you'll start questioning yourself.
Okay. I mean, we've both been working in this field for 20 plus years. Again, we can see many, many examples. The Syrian Alawite regime from Salah Jadid in 1966 to the fall of the Assads, they had a sectarian policy. Of course, they wanted to promote Alawite and Druze officers. Did they have a systematic and coherent vision of how to govern Syria? I would argue not. I think that in human affairs, it's important to not be too conspiratorial because it takes away the fuck-up factor, the mere haphazard of how things play out.
But I agree with you, but we also need to keep in mind that an occupation is not a normal state of a messy state. All states are messy. All of them have their problems. When you're a military occupation, you have a responsibility under law. We can accept that or not accept it. If you accept international law as being the body of law, which rules here because it's an occupation, great. If you don't complain about October 7th. We won't complain about a genocide, and we'll just fight it out. Because it's either the law of the jungle or international law. This is a military occupation. Are there rules and rhythm to this or not? And Israel says there's not. Only the force of might will decide. Well, if that's the case, take Hamas version 2 after the genocide. It's not going to be much better.
Going back to Palestinian opinion in the West Bank, I feel like that was an interesting point, but we haven't really delved deeper into it. What do you feel, and what would you say non-Hamas opinion might be about the release of so many Hamas prisoners with blood on their hands? There has become, from Gilad Shalit to the present, the idea that to get Israeli hostages given up, the Israelis should themselves release prisoners. I'm not sure that I like that precedent, or it's something that I would agree with. I'm kind of amazed that the Israelis are willing, given what happened with Gilad Shalit. They had to release Yahya Sinwar and many others. Why are they willing to release prisoners now? And what would you say the vibe is in Palestinian non-Hamas opinion? Should these convicted terrorists be released?
Let me start by giving context. Israel said because of these hostages that were taken from Israel, that they had the right to destroy 90% of Gaza, 600,000 homes, create a famine, etc., etc., etc. If that was the case for how many hostages are left now? 50 or so? What would be the Palestinian right to act on Israel for the holding of around 12,000 prisoners and about 600 dead bodies for decades? What I want to say is there is no calculation. For example, dead bodies, be they right, be they wrong in what they did, should not be a topic of negotiation. There's 600 plus bodies that Israel holds for decades. No wonder that there was a military action against Israel to try to bring that to the forefront. Same with prisoners. Most of the prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, the majority of them have not been convicted, have not been put through trial. They are administrative detainees. If I was Israel, I would surprise the world. And tomorrow, release all 10,000 that were illegally snatched out of their bed without a trial. And if I think somebody did something really wrong, I put them in a trial because there's a 99% conviction rate in Israeli prisons. They cannot keep holding people and then only release them, like now, which has happened before, like you said, in an exchange. Why do we put ourselves in a position that we have to have exchanges? To me, that's a very dark kind of move. Let's make sure we don't illegally arrest people. We don't hold bodies for years, and then for both sides. And then we won't have to take hostages to make a point that we need our prisoners back. Now, the prisoners who were convicted, we're talking about conviction within an Israeli prison, which doesn't have really justice for Palestinians. Do I state that all the people being released did nothing? No, probably some did something. Have they all served enough time to compensate for what they did? Probably in a normal justice system, yes. So I'm not worried that they're coming out of prison because most of them spent their whole lives in prison. But my bigger concern is the 10,000 Palestinians that are still in prison after all this is over with. And the next phase of Palestinian activists is going to say, oh, we got some out with October 7th. How about we have an October 8th and do the same thing to get the rest out?
Sam, tell us about the lives of regular people, West Bank Palestinians in places like Tulcharam or Khalil or Ramallah or Bethlehem. How have they been affected over the last 2 years? And what is the economic level of subsistence or business now in October 2025? Is it much worse than September 2023? Is it similar? Try to explain that for us.
Sure. The last 2 years have been devastating for the West Bank. Israel perfected over time, prior to October 7th, the fragmentation of the West Bank. So every community is dealt with a different level of military occupation. For example, where I live in Ramallah, we call it the 5-star occupation. That's good. The media is here and the corporate world is here and the leadership is here. So we get the least of the occupation, but it's still occupied. If you go to Gaza, you get the 0-star occupation. But in the West Bank, if you go north in the West Bank today, 2 years after this mess, you're finding that the West Bank is being Gazified under the radar. If you go to Jenin and Tulkarm, the refugee camps there have been depopulated of about 42,000 refugees, and the Israeli military is fully in control of those camps now. They're destroying homes, opening up roads that can have tanks go through them. So there's a structural change being made. That, of course, has devastated people's lives. If I was sitting on a bank, I can tell you the entire banking system here has more capital than we know what to do with, because we don't, for two reasons. One, we don't see enough feasible business plans coming to take loans because the feasibility of the society that they're working in is not there. But
This
there's
is a
another.
super interesting point because things are not investable. So, what are the sectors in 2026 that Gulfi money, Palestinian diasporic money, Lebanese Christian money that is in France that might want to help out? What is actually investable in Palestine in
Before I
2026?
answer this, let me say the second reason why the banks have so much money with them is that we have workers that used to go into Israel, about 250,000 of them every day, get paid in shekels, come back, spend those shekels in the West Bank, and those shekels end up in our bank accounts. We have a surplus of shekel, and the only country in the world that refuses to take back its own currency is Israel. They refuse. They give us a small quota. Other than that, they refuse to take the surplus of shekels that we have. And nobody takes a loan in shekels. So all of a sudden, it's a nice administrative way to drown the banks in Israeli currency. However, this is what I do for a living, trying to get people to invest in Palestine. The last 2 years has been devastating for business. But prior to that, we have not the world to offer, but we do have some strategic assets. For example, we have a tourism sector that will always be on the top of the list. It's not because we are tourist gurus. It's because a few prophets decided to die here, and now we're stuck with them for life. So we're building a sector around them. But that requires stability. And smarter Israel would understand that promoting stability means that their tourism sector would grow too, because whoever wants to come to Bethlehem also wants to go to Nazareth, etc., etc. So tourism is one. Secondly, the ICT sector here is booming, and it's booming out of being forced to be boomed because the fragmentation, Gaza is a good example of that, the fragmentation of our societies has made it very difficult to physically move. So the younger generation has adopted the digital economy much quicker than the past generation. The best of our communities that were engaged in the digital economy were in Gaza because they've been under lockdown for the last 16 years before this genocide started. Maybe that's why all the universities were the first to be destroyed in Gaza. So the ICT sector is one. The third that I would mention is, and now even more so after what we've seen happen, is that we are building a state. We were building a state prior to October 7th. We continue to build a state after this October 7th event. That means building materials, construction, energy, all of those state materials, state needs are going to be on the top of the list for my lifetime for sure, especially in Gaza.
Very interesting. Obviously, reconstruction requires construction materials. Is any major reconstruction predicated on Gulf money and willpower? And if so, how do you read what the Arabic Gulf states want to do in the absence of a longer political solution? You know, you and I are on the same page. We don't see this supposed eternal peace plan being an eternal peace plan. So we're in a messy, indefinite interim of one step forward, three steps back, and the occupation continuing. What are the Gulfies willing to pony up money for? And what is their vision in this interim?
Good question. I believe that, and I believe this before October 7th, that if the Gulf states can go to sleep one night and wake up and the Palestinians have disappeared, they won't have a problem with that. I think their engagement in Gaza now is a function of what the Trump administration wants them to do. And I think that will be the maximum that they will do. I don't think that they have an integral desire to build Gaza back better. I don't think they have, that's not their intention. Their intention that this Palestinian problem goes away. And if they feel that the Trump administration is engaged, which is questionable because the man has a short attention span, but if he stays engaged and he makes requests of them, or if the Kushner gang is actually doing a tit for tat for business deals to get money into Gaza, there may be some injection from the Gulf states. I would welcome that if it's done within the context of a Palestinian development plan. There is no foreign development plan for Gaza. I don't know if you saw the 38-page plan that came out of this Kushner effort. It's a glossy pie in the sky,
Yeah.
making Gaza Singapore. Again, it's comical. At the end of the day, there needs to be a Palestinian leadership overall in Gaza and the West Bank, and they have to up the game and define a strategy of how they define how Gaza should be rebuilt. Then they should reach out to golf players and non-golf players to see who would like to support. If the Palestinians fail to step up to the plate and bring their own plan forward, then we deserve whatever we're going to get.
Very interesting. Speaking of the need for Palestinian ownership, leadership, political processes, what do you feel about Abbas saying, oh, the PA is reforming? And then do you see an opportunity for something actually dynamic to emerge from a technocratic body in Gaza, or some kind of new bottom-up Palestinian process? Could there be elections? Tell us about that.
I've written much about this. You can find them on my website, epalestine.ps, specifically and boldly about Abbas and the PLO.
We'll put some links in the show notes to your content.
Those are, the last two, I haven't written since October 7th. My understanding was it was such a dramatic event. If people didn't understand on October 6th what was happening, they're not going to read anything on October 7th or 8th that's going to make them change their mind. So the last two articles that I wrote was about Abbas and about Saudi Arabia's normalization with Israel, and they still apply today. Abbas has expired in terms of his legitimacy popular-wise, his legitimacy electoral-wise, and his legitimacy politically. He failed politically.
He's also essentially physically expired given his age.
That's somebody else's decision. But at the end of the day, he needs to step aside. And I wrote extensively when he pulled the rug from the last call for elections. But ultimately, that has to happen from the Abbas side. In terms of Gaza or in the West Bank, because it's been floated here before as well. Interestingly, by the same Tony Blair that they're talking about in Gaza now, it was floated here in the West Bank, which is to have a technical government, a technocrat government. This is not real politics. We should not be looking to depoliticize Palestinians. We should be looking of incorporating all Palestinian efforts together in one political house so they can define a way forward. Having a techno government is kind of like having a department in a company. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a political problem par excellence. So what we need is a political leadership that can emerge from it. Techno units, technocrats to deal with specific issues, but that has to come under the auspices of a democratically elected representative, at least, government that drives all of these issues.
Sam, when I hear Palestinian technocratic government, which is going to work with Gulf allies and maybe oversee elections in the future, I don't see that as negative. I see that as hard to bring about, but it would be amazing if, for example, the water minister, and water is a big deal in Israel-Palestine, could be a top Palestinian water scientist. And if the ICT person could be someone who works with you that you know. That to me sounds good, rather than having a PA or Hamas apparatchik who, got up the greasy pole and actually knows nothing about water or ICT.
But I can dream with you of states that don't have politics, a depoliticized governing body. Everything is technocrat. That's not reality in today's world. If you want a democratically represented body that runs affairs, you have to have politics. It's part and parcel of the game.
And not always to start, because things that might have worked in Libya or Tunis post-Arab Spring were non-elected technocratic bodies that should have presided over constitution drafting. That those things didn't work for a range of reasons, I think, was not because they tried to have a technocratic body. So again, we can see these things slightly differently.
I'm not, as I said when I first stated this, I'm not against having technocrats working on technical issues. But ultimately, there's been an Israeli attempt to continuously try to depoliticize the Palestinian political body. I'll give you a great example. For years, the Israelis were handing money from Qatar to Hamas. For years. Like $800 million for years. Support, for what reason? To make sure that the Palestinian political body did not unite. That there's always this Hamas-Fatah separation. That is a political game that we will not allow to be played anymore with us. We want a representative And it's not only about Hamas and Fatah. I mean, the world is consumed with Hamas. I'll be very frank with you, and if whoever doesn't know might be surprised, what happened on October 7th was not only a Hamas event. So it's not only Hamas. So you're making a deal with Hamas. There's 5 or 6 other parties. Did they agree to this or not? You never know. I'd rather have an official Palestinian representative body that understands. It doesn't know about AI. It needs technical people to do that. It defines what needs to go to the technical realm and what stays in the political realm. That's how states function. That's how they taught us in Politics 101. If you find an example where states can dismiss politics and operate, I'd love to learn that model.
Well, it's a question of what's more realistic or not. Obviously, in the ideal world, there would be some kind of bottom-up, youth-driven political movement which would unite a Palestinian political process. Is there any dynamic youth organization going on in the West Bank? Would you say that?
I'm glad you asked that. When Abbas called for elections the last time, and then he withdrew them, there was a window we were able, the first time for 20 years, we were able to get a feel for what the community is thinking. Over 1,300 people, I think 1,390 some people came forward in 36 electoral slates and said, we want to lead Palestine. There were left, right, new thinkers, people we never heard of, business people. So basically, the community is boiling with interest to get involved into the political realm. And I think that's one of the reasons why he canceled the elections. Because Hamas and Fatah are both disliked in our society. They both failed. One decided to go to the Oslo peace process and negotiate. And as they negotiated, settlers got to be close to 1 million. And the other decided to have an armed attack against Israel, and we no longer have Gaza to show for it. Both of them took individual decisions without consulting the people, and both of them paid the price for it, and all the Palestinian people paid the price for it. So I think people are ready to come forward with new political thinking, and I think you'll be surprised with what people come forward with. There's been an armed reach out to the West, to Israel, to end the occupation, allow a Palestinian state to happen, and things will change. We're hearing a different story today from Israel, but I hope that this government in Israel is a hiccup, even though my brain tells me otherwise because I've studied the trajectory. But I still want to have hope that there are people in Israel who understand they can't keep sending their kids to the army to kill Palestinians. It's not going to work. And the 100,000 Israelis who already left Israel these last 2 years, they already know that very well.
I have, in my articles in the Boston Globe, written about and called for the internationalization of the administration of Gaza, both its borders, its reconstruction. I would see that only internationalization can work because the two sides don't trust each other. And in a situation where the two sides, Israelis and Palestinians, don't trust each other, there must be a third party who can mediate between them or who can act in the interest of both sides. Can we envision an internationalization of the reconstruction of Gaza? In other words, the decision of where roads are going to go and the electricity grid, to make an electricity grid which is tied into Egypt or the Eastern Mediterranean. Can you understand that being internationalized?
International role is key now because the magnitude of destruction is bigger than the Palestinians. Any internationalization effort will have to come within the realm of Palestinian-defined development. It's not Britain who's going to say where a road is going to be built in Gaza. Gazans will say where they want the road to be built, and they'll need help to build it. The same with the port, the same with an airport, the same with housing. It's the Palestinians who will define how they will live in their cities called in the Gaza Strip. Any removal of that important component is basically, we're going back to the colonial days where the colonial power can decide what should happen for these poor people that are just too backwards to define how they want to do their lives. We know how we want to run our lives. We have a big challenge on our hand. We're going to need a lot of help, but we don't want anyone to hijack our right to our self-development.
We can disagree agreeably, Sam. I see a greater role for internationalization, and I'm going to use the Libya example. In 2012 and 2013, when I was working in Libya, obviously there were a whole range of reconstruction and how to build a cabinet, how to set up an administration, capacity building of an army, of a security force on offer. And for the most part, the Libyans declined them. That, to me, was a big mistake. The Libyans turned away in the peaceful years of 2012, 2013, 2014, international capacity building. I don't see an Italian or French program about central bank governance as biased or neo-colonial in the context of a post-Gaddafian Libya. And I don't see a European Union-led program about house building or school building or the health sector in Gaza as self-interested. What is the EU's interest, negative interest in, for example, road building in Gaza? I don't see that. And again, I'm a Westerner and I come at these things from a perspective of wanting greater global leadership, particularly because I think that the implementation is going to be Arab-led. Do you know what I mean? Yes, there will be some European consultants, but the reality is it's going to be Qatari and Emirati money, probably using Turkish construction firms, probably employing Gazans with the program managers who are from Egypt and Lebanon. In other words, I don't see internationalization as a negative, but I see it as a necessary in Gaza.
All of the elements that you spoke about could be employed, but they must be employed under Palestinian directive. That's the point. The Palestinians
I'm
will
not
have
sure about
Turkish.
that, though, because
I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it because
Okay,
people
well,
have the right to self-determination. That's
I'm
a
not
right
sure
that
you
you
can
can't
have
take.
self-determination at this stage, right? Again, if we use a Libya example, it's all well and good to talk about elections and a constitution. However, given a 10-plus year multi-rounds of civil war in Libya, it's not really possible to have elections. You need economic reforms and technocratic governance before you can get to that point. If we try to go, oh, well, we need the will of the Libyan people to be heard, well, you're not going to be able to cut down on the corruption and the subsidies. You might say, well, this is a different situation. In Gaza, we don't have this exact civil war or whatever, but we do have a lack of technical capacity, and there is a lot of corruption and aid smuggling and every other sort of dysfunction, both aided and abetted by Israel and aided and abetted by gangs and militias that exist on their own right in Gaza. So I'm not sure that putting the cart before the horse of Palestinian self-determination is what can happen until you have technical level growth, governance, reconstruction.
Palestinian self-determination is not a destination. It's a process. In part, if we accept that Palestinians have self-determination, then we accept that the Palestinians today are not Libya. We have, as weak as it may be, we have a leadership, we have a Palestinian Authority, we have ministries, we have laws. This is not about Gaza. This is about Palestine. So Palestine has the functions of a state.
Okay,
to the point where that's
that.
why we're getting all these recognitions for statehood, right?
I 100% don't agree. And now I need to jump in and say, no, there are not state institutions, mafi muassasat, that function in Palestine.
No,
That's
we
not
do.
the
I mean,
reality.
I think you're very wrong on that. I live here. I live within institutions. Some of them I hate. Some of them I like.
Those institutions need to be entirely rebuilt.
The bank that I sat in as a board member for 22 years was regulated by the Palestinian Monetary Authority, a well-defined institution of the Palestinian Authority. I can go through all the different organizations and tell you which ones work well and which ones don't. I can probably do the same thing in the US. But to say that we are absent of a political reality on the ground that is an institutionally oriented reality is a disservice to what has been done for the last 20 years, which I was part of creating.
Well, my view is that these things do, of course, have institutions, and you have institutions in Libya, but trying to reform what exists will actually be harder than to build fresh. So, yes, I see that post-October 7th
You're throwing that out as a given. I mean, each institution would have to answer that question by itself.
No, again.
The Palestinian Monetary Authority needs no reform. The Palestinian Security Agency might need some. The Palestinian education system needs a lot of reform because they went off course with Oslo. So you can't just make these broad strokes that all the institutions need reform. It doesn't work that way in reality.
What is one thing you would propose to help bring together the Palestinian people with those who want to support them and help them in the international community? The Palestinians have millions upon millions of supporters, for lack of a better term, and I don't feel that they're able to benefit concretely. Yes, they can get some tweets or some protests, but who cares? You can't eat a tweet and you can't have your kids get educated on a protest. So give us something concrete. You're a Palestinian businessman. I have ideas about English language, Palestinian education, ICT, and newspapers, but I'm not living it. You're living it. What is something that international people can do that concretely helps Palestinians?
Good question. To order the disorder, the one thing I would say that would help the Palestinians would be to focus on the US. The disruption of the Israeli strangulation of the political system in the US as it relates to Palestine, Israel, is being untangled in front of us. It is okay now to run on a platform, if you're the mayor, the candidate of New York or other places, and say that you want an end to the occupation, that the genocide is wrong. The tide in the US is changing, and if the US starts acting in the US strategic interest, that would be a great help to the Palestinians. If the US continues to blindly support Israel, especially a right-wing Israel, then that's devastating for the Palestinians. On the ground, we'll take care of ourselves. There's not much that can be done here. What needs to change is the US, with their oversized involvement in this conflict, in blind support of Israel. And I do think it's changing. The polls are showing it. The streets are showing it. The candidates and the races are showing it. And the more people who get elected on a pro-Palestine, pro-peace agenda will start changing the US in the right direction. That doesn't mean to be anti-Israel, but to be pro-Israel as well, as long as Israel abides by international law.
That was very well said. I will not even express any disagreements with nuances. People can imagine what they might be. You've been a brilliant guest, Sam. I hope that we can do this again soon. If you have enjoyed this episode, you really should join our Mega Orderers Club, because you could have gotten it immediately after we had recorded it, and then it would help guide your views on hostage releases and why there wasn't this withdrawal or whatever. If you enjoyed hearing from Sam, you might really enjoy reading some of his thoughts about Palestinian ICT and other political developments. We are going to have links in the show notes to some of his content, and please join our Substack, where I'm going to have some more background on the Trump peace plan, what some on the Israeli commentariat are saying, that it's not really about peace and that it has no phase 2. And so I'm going to give a lot of content on the Substack there. And as always, we are hoping that you are going to have a more orderly week than debates about the Middle East, because they always end in disorder. So I wish you, the Mega Orderer, a Mideast free week.